Elena realized she had stopped loving Daniel in the middle of a restaurant full of people pretending not to notice what was happening. The table was covered in expensive plates and half-empty wine glasses, and Daniel was telling another story about her for entertainment. He described the time she cried in a grocery store parking lot after a panic attack, exaggerating details to make everyone laugh harder while casually touching her arm like an affectionate husband. People smiled awkwardly. Some laughed louder than others, and Elena sat there staring at the tablecloth while feeling something inside her finally disconnect. The humiliation itself was not new. What felt different was the sudden clarity that Daniel always became crueler when he had an audience. He needed people watching him. He needed someone beneath him in the room, and for years, she had been helping him perform that role perfectly. On the drive home, Daniel acted normal again. He complained about traffic, answered a work call, and asked if she wanted to stop for dessert as if he had not spent the evening turning her into the punchline of every conversation. Elena watched city lights slide across the car window while remembering who she used to be, before the relationship slowly trained her to shrink herself. Years earlier, she had been expressive, loud, emotional in a way that felt alive. She used to dance while cooking, interrupt movies to talk about random thoughts, and laugh hard enough to embarrass herself in public. Daniel had spent years convincing her those things were flaws. Not aggressively at first, just little comments repeated often enough to become part of her internal voice. You're too sensitive. You always overreact. Why do you make everything dramatic? Eventually, she began editing herself before speaking, apologizing before reacting, and staying quiet before even feeling. The next morning, Elena woke before sunrise and sat alone in the kitchen drinking coffee while the apartment remained silent around her. Their home looked beautiful from the outside. Clean furniture, soft lighting, expensive decorations, the kind of place people described online as goals. But sitting there alone, Elena suddenly realized she had not felt emotionally safe inside that apartment for years. Daniel walked into the kitchen, checking emails on his phone, and immediately criticized the groceries she bought, before casually suggesting she should start caring about herself again because she had let herself go lately. Then he kissed her forehead like he had done something loving. Elena stared at him quietly and understood something disturbing for the first time. Daniel genuinely believed he was a good husband. That realization frightened her more than his insults, because it meant he would never stop on his own. 3 days later, Elena joined a gym without telling him. The decision had nothing to do with revenge or attracting attention from other men. She simply needed one part of her life that belonged entirely to her again. The first workout was humiliating. She felt exhausted almost immediately, became hyper-aware of her body, and nearly left halfway through. But an older woman beside her smiled kindly and said, "The hardest part is showing up after feeling invisible too long." Elena thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. Slowly, the gym became more than exercise. It became an hour where nobody mocked her emotions or turned her reactions into entertainment. Nobody interrupted her identity. Nobody made her feel childish for existing too loudly. For the first time in years, she had somewhere to go where she did not feel observed by Daniel's judgment. Over the following months, Elena started changing in ways Daniel noticed immediately but could not fully understand. She stopped reacting emotionally during arguments. She stopped crying when he mocked her. She stopped defending herself against every criticism. At first, he liked the change because he assumed she was becoming easier to control, more mature, and less dramatic. But emotional detachment often looks peaceful right before a relationship dies. Daniel began growing uncomfortable when his jokes no longer upset her. One evening, he mocked her anxiety in front of friends again, expecting the usual reaction. But Elena simply smiled faintly and kept eating. Daniel looked confused for the rest of the night, because he suddenly had no emotional response to feed on. At the same time, Elena secretly began working online, doing small freelance administrative tasks from home while Daniel was away. The work itself was simple: emails, scheduling, spreadsheets, client support. But when the first payment arrived, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the number on her laptop with tears filling her eyes. It was not about the amount of money. It was about what the money represented. Nobody had handed it to her with contempt attached. Nobody had used it to remind her of her dependence. For the first time in years, she earned something that belonged completely to her. That same night, she opened a private savings account Daniel knew nothing about. It felt less like rebellion and more like oxygen slowly returning to a part of herself she thought had died. Daniel became increasingly unsettled as Elena's confidence quietly returned. She started wearing clothes she actually liked instead of clothes chosen to avoid criticism. She laughed more naturally around other people. She reconnected with old friends. She walked differently. The strange thing was that Elena did not become colder toward the world. She only became colder toward him. Daniel responded the way insecure people often do when they feel control slipping away. First came jokes about her new attitude. Then suspicion. Then irritation. One night he asked who she was trying to impress by suddenly caring about herself again. Elena realized the question itself revealed everything. Daniel had never truly loved her confidence. He loved being the person who controlled it. The breaking point arrived during another dinner party months later. Daniel invited coworkers over and spent the evening performing the same charismatic version of himself everyone loved. Halfway through dessert, he made another joke about Elena being emotionally exhausting and laughed while waiting for the room to join him. A few people smiled automatically, but this time one woman at the table looked directly at Daniel and calmly said, "You talk about your wife like she's your enemy?" The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting. Daniel laughed awkwardly and tried dismissing it as humor, but nobody supported him this time. Elena sat frozen for a moment because after years of doubting herself, hearing another person recognize the cruelty out loud felt surreal. It was the first time someone had interrupted the performance, instead of quietly accepting it. The argument after the guests left was inevitable. Daniel accused Elena of embarrassing him, changing too much and acting superior ever since she started focusing on herself. But Elena no longer felt afraid during the conversation. She simply felt tired. Tired of defending her emotions. Tired of shrinking herself to protect his ego. Tired of confusing survival with love. When Daniel demanded to know what happened to her, Elena finally answered honestly, "I remembered who I was before I met you." The sentence hit him harder than screaming would have, because it exposed the truth beneath everything. Daniel had built the relationship around a smaller version of her. A few weeks later, Elena signed the lease for a small apartment across town without telling him. The place was tiny, outdated, and far less beautiful than the life they currently shared. But when she walked through it alone, she felt something she had not experienced in years. Emotional safety. She spent weeks preparing quietly, saving money, organizing documents, planning logistics. Women often learn to leave silently because experience teaches them that the moment control disappears, some men become unpredictable. By the time Daniel realized something was truly changing, Elena had already emotionally left the relationship months earlier. The final conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone when Elena placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside were bank statements, apartment documents, and divorce papers. At first, he genuinely believed it was manipulation or some temporary emotional reaction. Then he looked at her face and panic entered the room. He cycled rapidly between anger, denial, blame, and promises, trying every emotional strategy that had controlled the relationship for years. Elena listened quietly because she had already grieved the marriage long before that moment arrived. When Daniel finally asked how she could throw everything away after all the years together, Elena looked around the apartment carefully before answering. "Because I spent years disappearing here, and you were happier when I did." She moved out 4 days later. The first night alone felt terrifying and peaceful at the same time. The apartment was small. The future was uncertain. She still cried unexpectedly sometimes, and still heard Daniel's voice in her head on difficult days. But slowly, something inside her began returning. She worked late into the night at her laptop, rebuilt routines, decorated the apartment little by little, and relearned how to exist without constantly monitoring someone else's mood. Months later, one of Daniel's old friends asked her if she missed him. Elena thought carefully before answering. She missed familiarity. She missed routine. She missed the version of life she once hoped the relationship could become. But she did not miss feeling emotionally small every single day. That night, she stood by the apartment window looking at her reflection in the glass. She was not fully healed. Not fearless. Not magically transformed into someone new. But for the first time in years, she felt real again. And after spending so long being treated like a supporting character inside someone else's ego, feeling real mattered more than being loved.